Centurion mk5/1 script. After World War II, when the Australian Armoured Corps size was radically reduced because of the goal of creating a smaller, more professional army that was always ready for battle. The Corps of the Iraq was the first armoured regiment which were initially armed with Churchill mk7 tanks, although later in 1951 they got 117 Centurion mk3 tanks as well as some engineering tanks. The first armoured regiment did not take part in the Korean War. When Australia joined the Vietnam War on the American side in 1965, they were assigned by the American command to control the territory to the east of Saigon. Initially there was only an infantry group, an armored cavalry squadron and a few auxiliary units. New units were rotated in, and the first Australian task force grew to 4,000–5,000 soldiers, who controlled the Phuoc Tuy province in South Vietnam. The Australian Air Forces and Navy also took a limited part in these operations. Armored vehicles were first limited to a squadron of tracked M113A1 APCs arriving with cavalry regiments. Starting in 1966, the vehicles fought, revealing their weakness and lack of weaponry. The Australians were suddenly confronted by a formidable foe armed with heavy machine guns, recoilless rifles, and anti-tank rocket launchers. Heavy fighting in February 1963, which claimed the lives of 15 troops and injured 53 others in just a few days, is reported to have influenced the decision to arm the Australian task force with tanks. The Australians decided they needed improved armoured vehicles, with more armour and better weaponry. So they upgraded their existing Centurion mks by strengthening the front armour, replacing one of the machine guns with a bigger ranging machine gun and installing an anti-air machine gun to be controlled by the commander. They also added a floodlight and night vision equipment for the whole crew. To increase the Centurion's poor range, a 100-gallon fuel tank was attached to the rear. Captain Peter Badman's C Squadron arrived in the Republic of Vietnam on February 27. It consisted of 2 squads of 4 tanks each, 2 commander tanks, 2 bulldozers, and 2 armored recovery vehicles. When the tankers arrived, they got right to work. The 3rd Cavalry Regiment's Centurions and APC supplied fire support during Operation Pinaroo, which involved the discovery and destruction of Viet Cong outposts in the mountains. A mine disabled 1 tank, but it was repaired. The battle for isolated Balmoral and Coral firebases against Viet Cong partisans assisted by the Vietnamese People's Army 7th Infantry Division was a true test for the Australian forces. The action involved nearly all Australian units in Vietnam at the time, the Royal Australian Regiment's 1st and 3rd Infantry Battalions, the 3rd Cavalry Regiment's A Squadron, and the 12th Artillery Regiment's batteries. Australian UH-1 helicopters and Canberra bombers provided fire support. For the Australians, the battles for Balmoral and Coral were the most action-packed of the Vietnam War. The C Squadron marched 120 kilometers from New Idat to the Coral base on May 22 to 23, losing 1 bulldozer to a mine. The 2 tank teams were split between the 1st and 3rd Infantry Battalions and fought for over a week to repel Vietnamese attacks on both locations. The Australians would launch counterattacks on enemy field fortifications and fire positions on a regular basis. These raids were actively participated in by the tanks. Many rebounds per game 2 grenade hits were recorded against the Centurions, but they were unable to penetrate the armor. There were no fatalities, but a handful of crew members received minor injuries. Early in June, the strikes ceased, and the squadron returned to New Idat. The Australians suffered 25 dead and over 100 wounded while the Vietnamese lost over 200. In September 1968, when the number of Australian tanks in the theater reached 28, the main tactical unit was downsized to a 4-tank squad. There were no major clashes, but C Squadron was deployed to keep the region under control. On the 21st and 22nd of August, 2 squads of Centurions were sent to Long Dinh to repel an attack. The tanks withstood another rebounds per game bombardment, but one was moderately damaged this time. In the fall and winter of 1968, enemy mines were the major opponent of Australian tankers. On September 15, One tank hit a mine and was rendered utterly useless, vehicle beyond local repair. In December, 2 more tanks were damaged, one of which killed the driver. In January 1969, 2 more tanks were damaged. The Centurions of the 1st Armored Regiment were modified as a result of the experience gained in 1968. To provide extra protection, tankers attached spare track connections to the front. The turret was welded with a carrier for additional machine gun ammunition. Smoke grenade launchers, an infrared lamp, and skirt armor were all removed because they were deemed unnecessary. Tanks were frequently equipped with American PRC-25 radios. Other small adjustments were also made. On June 6 to 8, 1969, heavy fighting, by Australian standards, erupted over Binh Ba village, a key Viet Cong stronghold. A fighting group from the 5th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment attempted to storm the settlement with the help of virtually all of B Squadron, M113 APCs from the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, and Australian UH-1 helicopters, but were met with fierce opposition. The Vietnamese, armed with new Rebounds Per Game 7 launchers, destroyed 2 of the leading squad's tanks. The other tanks continued to provide excellent support for their infantry, and the Australians declared victory on June 8 morning. Only 1 individual was murdered, while 10 others were injured. The successful utilization of tanks explains the reduced losses. The Vietnamese are thought to have taken around 100 casualties. After the battle for Binh Ba, B Squadron resumed its normal operations. The fighting intensity for the entire Australian Army reduced. In the Australian zone, successful anti-partisan efforts led the Vietnamese to adjust their tactics. Major Jack Chipman commanded a squadron that arrived on rotation in December 1969. They were soon involved in a large-scale anti-partisan effort, Operation Hammersley. On February 17 to 18, nearly the entire squadron backed up the 8th Infantry Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment in its attack on a big partisan base in Long Hai. The Centurions were subjected to intense rebounds per game fire, although only a few tankers were injured. End of the Centurion mk5/1. A squadron's operations lasted until December 1970, when it was replaced by C Squadron, commanded by Major P. Burke. The tankers planned to leave Vietnam in May of 1971 after a relatively quiet period. The Combat Journal announced operations of tanks in Vietnam have ceased, on August 29, 1971. The tanks were transported out of the battle zone in September. In October and November, the rest of the Australian forces arrived. According to widely recognized evidence on the battle in Vietnam, the 1st Armored Regiment deployed 58 Centurion mk.51 tanks, 6 of which were damaged beyond repair. 2 men were killed in action, while 7 more died of wounds, according to the Veterans Association's official website. In Vietnam, the 1st Armored Regiment was awarded 3 battle honors, Coral Balmoral, Binh Ba, and Ha Dai. After Vietnam, the Centurion mk.51 tanks were no longer in service. In 1972, the Australian Army began comparing the West German Leopard 1 and the American M60 Patton tanks. The German tank was victorious. The 1st Armored Regiment's last parade with Centurions took place in November 1976, following which training with modern tanks began. Some Centurion mk.51 tanks ended up in museums. Among these, the truck on display at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra distinguishes itself for having fought in Vietnam and retaining its wartime appearance.